nice to see the world back to, well, normal over there. I feel like maybe it's about 6 months further on than maybe where Australia is at the moment. And I've never seen Paris so busy in my whole life. There were lines to get into restaurants. It was great. So to see so many people out and about having a great time. Yeah.
Well, I mean, they must have all been so shocked not being able to go out to dinner, because there's such a pavement cafe culture, aren't they?
Yeah. I think they were making up for it. And I think the tourists were traveling again for the first time too in September, October. So I think that's why it was extra busy. It was also Paris Fashion Week while I was there. So just the watching people on the street was super fun, because everyone was wearing extravagant outfits and we could have just literally stood there and done that and had a great time.
Oh, goodness. Okay, well, I'm going to start in a second. So, Natasha, it's lovely to see you. I can see we've got lots of people flowing in from Orange in New South Wales, from Canberra, from Melbourne, from Ningi, is that how I pronounce it, in Queensland? From Blue Mountains in New South Wales, Yeppoon in Queensland, Sydney, Orange, Gippsland. Oh my God, they're all coming in, loving this book. So Lord Howe, oh, there's
Wow.
a nice place. Naganawal country, Adelaide, Perth, another one from Adelaide, Southern Sydney. They are all coming in. So, oh, Hoppers Crossing, I have to mention that one. So, Natasha, lovely to see you again, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Australian Women's Weekly Books and Bubbles. I'm Juliet Reedon. I'm editor-at-large and books editor of the Australian Women's Weekly, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we all meet today, which in my case and Natasha's case here in Sydney is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This beautiful land that we're on. It's been pouring with rain today, but there was some lovely sun this afternoon, wasn't there? My guest this evening is the fabulous novelist, Natasha Lester. Natasha, wonderful to see you. We were in lockdown the last time Natasha and I chatted on Books and Bubbles, and those of you who were there may recall Natasha giving us a few little hints about a new book she was working on. Well, this is it. The Three Lives of Alix St. Pierre. Is that correct pronunciation? Alix St. Pierre?
If you wanted to be really French, you could say Alix St. Pierre, but we'll just go with Alix St. Pierre. That's perfect.
Oh, I'm going to go with Alix St. Pierre. I think it was so magnifique. We'll dive into the pages shortly. First of all, though, I have a few housekeeping points I'd like to run through. If you haven't already, you can purchase special signed copies by Natasha of this new book, The Three Lives of Alix St. Pierre. Alix St. Pierre, I think I got it right there, from our event partner, QBD. There's a link in the chat box on your screen. Please do send through questions for Natasha as we talk. I'll get through as many as I can. They can be entered into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Or if you're tuning in via Facebook, you can leave a comment and that will get to us as well. If you enjoyed tonight, don't miss our next event. It's on Wednesday, the 23rd of November, and I'll be chatting to Katie Nunn about her new book, The Only Child. I don't know whether you've read it yet, but if you haven't, it's a fantastic, evocative, unsettling tale of past misdeeds and a crime thriller that will have you on the edge of your seat. Visit booksandbubbles.com.au. That's booksandbubbles.com.au to sign up to our newsletter and to register for this event. If you sign up to the newsletter, you'll be the first to find out about all our upcoming events, and you can also find our past events, including this one afterwards, available to watch on demand. So those are my housekeeping. Remember, booksandbubbles.com.au and QBD, our wonderful event partner, to buy signed copies of the book. Now, on to tonight. I know you're all already huge fans, which is why you're here, But just in case there are any newcomers out there, newcomers to Natasha's work, that is, I'm going to take this chance to talk through a few of her triumphs.
I might just go and hide while you do that part.
Les Trois Vies de Alix Saint-Pierre. The Three Lives of Alix Saint-Pierre is Natasha's 7th novel. 7th, is that right? Yeah. She's a New York Times best-selling fiction writer. Her books are published around the world in multiple languages. She's just been telling us how she's #1 in Norway at the moment. And in this novel, like The Paris Seamstress, The French Photographer, and The Paris Secret, we're back in the city of love and cocktails, as it happens. Gay Paris. We are also true to form in the world of fashion. Yay! Notably, the beginning of the career of a certain Monsieur Christian Dior. Natasha does spend a good deal of time in Paris researching, but she lives in Western Australia, in Perth, with her family, and didn't actually break into fiction writing until 2016. Prior to that, she worked for the beauty company L'Oréal, another little French place. When she's not writing, Natasha loves collecting vintage fashion, is also a fashion illustrator and a bit of a history nerd. So without more ado, let's dive into the 3 lives of Alix Saint-Pierre. Natasha, fantastic to see you.
Oh, it's lovely to see you again too, Juliet. One day we'll have to do one of these in person in a room together rather than on a screen, but this is a lovely way to do it, to see people who can't come to their live events.
And with the bubbles.
Definitely with the bubbles, the real stuff too. Shit are spoiling me.
Now, look, this is a fascinating novel. There's a short prologue set in 1937 in Paris, and then we jump to 9 to 10 years later. And then in part 2, we go back 5 years to 1943. Then we jump again. Tell us what's going on here, Natasha.
That's a good question. I didn't know for half the time I was writing the book what was going on there, but eventually what is going on is that we are following in the footsteps of Alix Saint-Pierre, who is the publicity director for the not quite launched House of Christian Dior in Paris in late 1946. Alix has a mysterious past to do with the war that she's keen to keep to herself, but someone from her past is very eager to find out exactly what she did during the war. So she finds herself in Paris, juggling the demands of trying to get the press to come to the first showing from this new and unheard of designer named Christian Dior, and trying to escape the people who are trying to uncover her past.
Right, that's a little taster. Look, I feel as if there may be some of your personal loves in the character of Alix. Give us a bit of a description of Alix. What makes her tick?
So Alix is a stubbornly independent woman, and probably if you asked my husband what characteristic might define me, he would probably say stubbornly independent as well. But Alix has found herself in this quite precarious place in society, I suppose you could say, where during wartime, women were actively encouraged to go out and work, and they took on some amazing jobs in factories, in intelligence work, spying, etc. And then immediately as the war ended and the men came back to retake up their positions, women were actively encouraged to go back to the kitchen and back to domestic life and to confine themselves to the home. And Alix isn't terribly keen to do that. She feels like she has a lot more to offer. So she is trying to forge a path for herself as a single woman who works, when to be a single woman who works for the love of it is quite unheard of at that time. So I think in terms of, you know, those characteristics that might be similar, I'm also someone who works because I love it, just like Alix is. She has a bit of a passion for fashion. I could confess to having a similar passion. And she especially has a passion for Christian Dior's gowns, which is something that I'm rather fond of too.
I mean, she's also got this interesting, I mean, she's not French. She's, tell us where she's from.
Okay, so Alix is American. She has French parents, but she's from LA, in fact. And the reason I did that was because I saw this incredible photograph of Christian Dior on the staircase at the couture house, surrounded by his senior management team. And when you look at the photograph, 12 of the people surrounding Christian Dior are women. And there's only one other man in that photograph, his business manager, Jacques Rouet. And I thought, wow, I had no idea that Dior had so many women in senior roles in his couture house. And I wanted to find out more about that. So as I started to dig, I realized that the directrice of his ateliers was a woman, the directrice of the studio was a woman, his assistant designer was a woman, his directrice of sales was a woman. And I thought, wow, nobody knows who those women are anymore. Their names have been forgotten. The only name anybody knows when it comes to the House of Dior is the name of Christian Dior himself. But I would lay my life on the fact that he wouldn't be the icon he is today, and he wouldn't have been the success that he was and still is if it hadn't have been for those women. So I wanted to dig into telling people a little bit more about them and why they should perhaps be remembered as well as Christian Dior. And when I was looking into that, I discovered that he had one other man on his management team, and that was his director of publicity, who was an American man who only lasted for a year. And I thought, right, I can change history because history has so often been changed to erase the women. I'm going to change history to erase that man, and I'm going to make him into an American woman named Alix Pierre, who heads up the publicity at the House of Christian Dior, so I can explore all of these incredible women who worked so hard to make that couture house a success.
Fabulous. I love that idea.
Me too.
I love that idea. But look, let's talk about that idea of fact and fiction, because there's a lot of fact in there, isn't there? The story is based on fact. Tell us which parts are fact, and tell us about that research element for you.
So when I began to do my research into the book, I realized that there were so many incredible, fascinating facts about Christian Dior himself and the birth of the couture house that I actually didn't need to make very much stuff up. And it was absolutely a case that reality was stranger than fiction, and I could never have made these things up because people wouldn't have believed that this was real. They would start to read and kind of fall out of the world. But when this is what actually happened, you can absolutely put these things into the story. So, for example, there almost wasn't a House of Christian Dior because there was a man named Marcel Boussac, who was the biggest textile manufacturer in France, and he wanted to finance Dior into his own couture house. Christian was working for Lucien Delonge at the time, who was the director of the Chambre syndicale de la haute couture, which was the governing body for haute couture in Paris. And Dior hummed and hawed. He was a very shy man. And then eventually decided that no, he wasn't the kind of person who could manage a couture house. So he sent Marcel Boussac a telegram and said, "I'm sorry, I'll have to decline your offer." The next day, he went to see his fortune teller because Dior was obsessed with good luck charms. He carried lucky stars in his pockets, and he went to see his fortune teller regularly. And his fortune teller said to him, "You are going to be a huge success in the future, and your success is all to do with women." And Dior kind of looked at her and thought, "Oh, women. Maybe that couture house thing might be a good thing to do after all." And so he rapidly left the fortune teller, telephoned Marcel Boussac and said, "Is there any chance you haven't read my telegram yet?" And Boussac said, "No, I've read it." And Christian was like, "Okay, throw it away. I'm going to do this. I'm going to start this couture house." So who knew that fortune tellers could be so accurate? So when you're given facts like that, you can't help but include them in the novel. And there were so many other amazing details about that very first show that I didn't know about, and I loved reading, and I thought, I bet readers are going to love reading this too. You know, things like Dior recounting the night before the show and how everybody is still at the couture house at 2:00 in the morning. The dresses aren't finished, even though they've got to be shown at 10:00 the next morning. The programs haven't been printed. He's reworking dresses on these mannequins who've been working for 24 hours, who are exhausted. And he tells the story of discovering himself standing there holding only a pair of falsies because the mannequin that they had belonged to has fainted and fallen to the floor at his feet because she's so tired from working there for so long. And he recounts how on the day of the show, the carpet on the grand staircase is still being hammered down 30 minutes before everybody floods in and fills the couture house, that the first mannequin to go out trips and falls over, bursts into tears, is so hysterical, she refuses to go back out there again. The second mannequin that goes out is wearing one black shoe and one brown shoe. So you'd think that based on all of that, it would have been an absolute disaster. But luckily the clothes were so gorgeous that everybody focused only on the new look and not on the crying and the tripping over and the mismatched shoes.
I love all your descriptions of being inside that couture house. They're so vivid. So congratulations.
Oh,
and
thank
we really feel a part of that world. And it's so wonderful to be part of the world of Christian Dior. I want to talk a little bit about his new look, as it was called, because it really did change fashion and change how women dressed. I'm just going to read a little passage here, which is your description of the Dior shape. You say, it was the silhouette unashamedly of a woman, the curve of breast and hip, the inward sweep of a waist, dresses that showed who a woman really was. Everything she'd been hiding since the war had required her to shroud her true self and her true shape. Everything she'd forgotten to reveal since the war had ended. But now Christian Dior was saying through his gowns, live. I mean, I love that passage. I love it. Those creations were pretty breathtaking. Tell us about that magic. What is that new look?
So the new look is, I suppose, to understand the new look, you have to understand what women were wearing in wartime, which was largely a result of fabric rationing, because obviously everything was rationed in wartime. So we had women wearing very boxy jackets with square shoulders, mostly because they'd been recut from men's suits, because most men were either fighting or prisoners of war. So there was a surplus of men's clothing available. And skirts were sort of on the knee, very sort of slim and using as little fabric as possible. So the new look was the reverse. You've got skirts that go down to the ankle. You've got curved, shaped shoulders. You've got fitted waists, a little bit of cleavage on display. And I loved the way in which Christian's reacted to that kind of wartime silhouette by saying, no, I want to show off women if they wish to be shown off in their kind of true shape, if you like, because Christian Dior is often kind of made into a bit of a culprit for that whole kind of re-domestication of women after the war, because people sort of say, oh, his clothes were very feminine and therefore very conservative and a bit of a throwback to kind of that Belle Epoque era. But actually, when you look at everything that he was doing, it was all about celebrating women at a time where they were no longer celebrated because they had been actively discouraged from working. They were being asked to give up their independence, to give up their money, to return to that very subservient role in the home. And Christian was saying, no, but I want women to be able to be women as they are. And society found that very confronting. And I think that's one of the reasons why the new look was actually so controversial, because here was a society trying to put women in their place. And here you had Dior saying, no, let's let women be whoever they want to be. And so you have all these protests where there's a mannequin in Montmartre on Rue Lepic being photographed by Willie Maywald. And you've got these two ladies ripping her dress off her because they're so incensed at Dior's excessive use of fabric and the way he's shaped these gowns. And then when Dior goes to New York in 1947, he's greeted by these protesters, one of whom is holding this placard saying, Mr. Dior, we abhor dresses to the floor. and another one holding up a sign saying the just below the knee club, because the belief was that skirts should sit on the knee or just below, not down to the ankle. So Dior was being decried because his dresses were too long. And isn't that interesting, where now the perception is that women's skirts are too short and we're all being told off because of that. And it made me realize that no matter what women wear at any time in history, it will be wrong and society will condemn them for it. And here is this kind of cycle that just goes on and on, no matter what we wear. We're being kind of put in our place and told not to wear the clothes that we're wearing, and how that becomes kind of a form of really keeping women in their place. So I wanted to kind of unpick all of those things through the lens of this new look that was so iconic and so different to what had been made in fashion before.
Now, one of the things that you talk about is movie icon Rita Hayworth, who agreed to wear Dior to the premiere of her new film, and also to come to that very first launch show of Dior. Did that happen?
Yes, it did. So I found out that Rita Hayworth wore a gown called Soirée to the premiere of her movie Gilda in Paris, a Parisian premiere. It's slightly later, a couple of months later than I've used it in the book, because when you're writing fiction, you can manipulate time in any way, shape or form, which is wonderful. And then she did come to his first show as well, and she ordered 6 gowns from the first show. One of them is an amazing dress called Maxim's, named after the restaurant in Paris called Maxim's. And it's this amazing black gown that she just looks absolutely incredible in. And whilst there is one very iconic photograph of Rita in her Maxim dress, there are no photos that exist of Rita at her Gilda premiere wearing Soirée. So I looked high and low, I looked everywhere because I was desperate to find that. But it was the start of Rita's affiliation with Dior, which continued over her lifetime. And it was the start of designers dressing movie stars for their film premieres, and was a part of the reason why Dior was so successful and so clever, that he realized that forging alliances with people outside of fashion, outside of mannequins, might be a way forward to show more people his gowns. And, you know, because he was a very shrewd marketer. He had official copies of his dresses placed in department stores in New York and here in Australia. Australia was one of the very first countries to show Dior's gowns and to have those available at David Jones in Sydney. So it was
Australian Women's Weekly ran the show.
Absolutely, they did indeed. I know. And I love that Australian connection between Dior and fashion. So yes, he was very shrewd, and movie stars are a big part of it. And Rita was the very first one. So that's all true.
And of course, that shrewdness you put into Alix. It's Alix who found Rita and who connected her to this show. So that's wonderful. Look, Judith Graff is asking, are there any photos or film reels of that very first show?
There are several photos. I've started to put some of those on my Instagram page. There's a particularly famous photograph of a mannequin wearing the bar suit, which is that white jacket and that black skirt. That's quite an icon of the new look. And there's several other photographs. There are no film reels. There's an amazing film reel that I found of the mannequins practicing their walkthrough for the show. And as I said before, they were still hammering down the carpet. So it's a reel, and they're walking up the grand staircase. There's a ladder on the staircase. There are workmen on the ladder painting the walls as the mannequin walks past the night before the show, doing her walkthrough. She's holding her skirt up so she doesn't trip on it on the staircase. And behind her is this ladder and these men painting. It's the most amazing reel. I just loved it to bits. But the beautiful part about those photographs, I read in Dior's memoir that suddenly so many people wanted to come to the show after his very clever publicity team garnered so much interest in the show, that the grand salon could fit 240 people. They had to make 30 standing room places around the outside of the grand salon. They had to remove a minor staircase to fit 40 more people. And they had to cram 50 people onto that grand staircase that you see photographs of. And the photographs from that very first show show this grand staircase literally crammed full with people, shoulder to shoulder. They show the grand salon where there's no space at all except for where the mannequins walk through. And all around the salon were these tall white columned ashtrays, because of course everybody smoked back then. And you can see the mannequin's skirts sweeping past, knocking the ashtrays over, but nobody notices. They're all completely focused on the dresses. So thank goodness they did have a photographer there, because those pictures are amazing.
Quite a fire risk as well.
Yes, you'd think, but who cares when there's fashion?
Does that house still exist?
Yeah, so it does. The original house was on Avenue Montaigne, and that was a townhouse that Dior purchased. And then right next door around the corner on number 1 Rue Francois Premier is where they've extended the couture house and where the main store is now. And in fact, they've done something really beautiful now. And if anyone's going to Paris at any time, I absolutely encourage you to go and see this. They've made part of that into a museum called Galerie Dior, and it's accessible to the public. You need to reserve your place in advance, and you can go in, and they have a lot of the gowns on display. They have a lot of information about Dior. They have some amazing photographs. It's just absolutely beautiful. And I took all of my 3 kids, even my 12-year-old son, and everybody had a great time. So definitely check that out when you're in Paris next.
And did you have any connection with Dior writing the novel? Did you talk to the House of Dior at all?
So I used their archives. They have a massive archive, unbelievable archive of photographs, of film, of gowns, of newspaper clippings, programs, program notes, sketches, illustrations. So I was able to access some of the photos. It was hard because it was COVID and I was in Australia, so there was a limit to what they could kind of scan and send. And obviously, you know, I'm not like a very important nonfiction writer writing some treatise about Dior. I'm just writing a novel. So there were limits to what I could access, but you know, my dream would be to go into that archive and spend a week in there fossicking through everything, because even just something as simple as so they would create a chart for each show, and it would have a swatch of the fabric for each dress, the name of each dress, a little illustration of each dress, the name of the mannequin who would wear it, what color shoes she would wear with it, what jewelry she would wear with it. And they're just like these works of art in themselves, just the chart run through for the show. So yeah, it's lots of fun. It's a hard life being a novelist.
Very hard life. Do you have any Dior yourself?
I do have one 1970s Dior dress that I purchased from a vintage fashion dealer. It's about all I can afford. I can't afford the genuine actual Dior haute couture. That might be a dream one day. I particularly love, obviously, Dior's creations from 1947, but they're actually priceless. If I was able to, I would love to purchase one from when Raf Simons was the creative director at the House of Dior. He made some exquisite pieces, and I keep my eye on the vintage auctions to see if one comes up. And if there is, I'll be bidding no matter what.
Well, knowing I was going to be talking to you today, I pulled out my Dior, which is just the lipstick, but there you go.
I actually love how many people have said to me they went and purchased the perfume Miss Dior after they read my book, The Paris Secret. So they had their own little piece of Catherine Dior, which is a story I love.
Oh, I hope you got some commission on that.
Yeah, no.
Next time. You need Alix in there for you. Look, there are lots of powerful women in this tale. Do you see it as a feminist novel?
Absolutely. In fact, it's funny, when I started writing it, because all my other novels had been quite feminist in terms of showing women doing something unusual or extraordinary for their time in history and the obstacles they had to face, I was a little bit worried that this one didn't have that thread through it. And then when I realized, no, actually, it's all about Alix trying to be allowed to work and to be a single woman and to keep her independence in a world that doesn't let her wear trousers into any public bars or restaurants at that time. In fact, it wasn't until the 1990s that France repealed the law forbidding women from wearing trousers in bars and restaurants. Can you believe? She's not allowed to open a bank account in her own name. She can't get credit as a single woman. If she wants to do any of those things, she has to get married and get her husband's permission to have a bank account and to get credit. And when I realized there were all of these barriers just to living as a woman, she didn't have to be flying aeroplanes or doing anything like that. She just had to simply be a woman alive in this time, in this city, in this world, and there were barriers all around her. So the book is a lot about the everyday struggles that women face to simply exist in a world that was primarily set up for men and their needs, and for a family unit that was domestic in its nature.
Now, I know you love Paris. We've talked about how many books you've set in Paris. Tell us a little bit about your relationship with Paris. When did you first go there? Why is it you love it so much?
So my relationship with Paris, I suppose, began when I studied French in high school, and I loved the language. And I often think that a love of a culture comes through understanding the language that's spoken. And then after I left high school, I continued my language studies. And then the very first time I went to France, I was a backpacker. I went with a very good friend of mine, and we stayed in this crazy hotel that had an amazing view of the Notre Dame. That was the only good thing going for this hotel. It was wallpapered in psychedelic wallpaper. You wouldn't have ever wanted to come back to your room having had a few drinks, because the wallpaper would have made you throw up, let alone the alcohol. So we couldn't stay in the room. It was too much for anyone's senses. So which meant we had to kind of spend our days walking around Paris, which was no great hardship. And then since then, I worked obviously for L'Oréal Paris for a number of years, which is a French company. And that, involved translating French packaging into English. So again, your French language skills improve immeasurably. And then once I married, we started to go to Paris pretty much every year. My kids have been from the time they were babies. They would say, if you ask them what their favorite thing about France is, the breakfasts. French breakfasts they think are the best in the world, and so is the bread, and they are right, actually. And I just love, I think now I speak the language almost fluently. So for me, it's easy to get around, to research French history, because a lot of the documents are actually in French. So all of those things just contribute to my love of the art, the culture, the buildings, the ambiance, the language, the history, all of it.
And do you have a favorite place
in France?
Yeah, favorite hangout. I know this particular novel, by the way, is full of bars.
It is. Bars and drinks, French 75s, yes. And chocolate tart, actually. So, that's so hard. Like, what a challenging question. One place. Oh goodness, that's going to take me quite a while to come up with something. There is a beautiful, one of my very favorite places in Paris is a little church called the Sainte-Chapelle, which is on the Ile de la Cité, and it has the most amazing stained glass windows. I mean, obviously Paris is replete with beautiful churches, but this one, there are benches around the church and you're encouraged to sit and look at the stained glass windows. And if you take the time to do that, it is absolutely exquisite, and it's an experience unlike any other. And it's absolutely just a beautiful thing to do. So that's something I recommend for anyone who goes to Paris. This time when we were in Paris, we decided to stay on the Ile Saint-Louis, which is one of the two islands in the middle of the Seine, which is joined up to the Ile de la Cité. So it's the original kind of part of Paris, if you like. It's where Paris began. And it was beautiful because the residential area, we hired an apartment and we stayed there. And that has quickly become one of my favorite places. Also, there's an ice cream shop called Bertillon, which is very famous in Paris, and it's located on the Ile Saint-Louis. So needless to say, myself and my kids indulged in Bertillon ice cream every day that we're in Paris recently.
Now, lots of people are asking about your writing process. Peter Maitland says, how do you know when it's time to stop researching and start adding to it? Peter says, stop researching for the truth and start your creative license and adding your part to the story. And I also want to know, how do you plan? Where do you start?
So my answer might be slightly different to other historical novelists. I think as a writer, you have to find your own way, and it's great to listen to other writers talk about their way, but your way will probably be different to what every other writer says. So for me, I'm a very planned and organized person in every area of my life. In fact, my husband might say I'm a bit of a control freak, but my creativity does not thrive on control. It thrives in chaos. And as much as I've tried to sit down and plan out a book in advance, I find myself unable to do it. So I can't do very much research to begin with because I don't know what the story is yet. And so the danger would be for me that if I was to start researching up front, I would never stop because I would never know where the bounds of the scope of my research are. So I usually just read one book that's about the broad topic I'm writing about. So when I sit down to write 3 Lives of Alix and Pierre, I know that I'm writing about a woman who's the publicity director for the House of Dior. And that's pretty much about it. So I've got to work out, okay, what is the story? What about if I just put her in the couture house on her very first day at work meeting Christian Dior? That's where we're going to start. And so I'll write a scene around that, and that might give me an idea for the next scene and then the next scene. And so I don't do very much research at all. I read Dior's autobiography, Dior and I, when I was writing that first draft, and that's all I did. Then I have a month off at the end of the first draft where I go and usually I travel. Obviously, COVID times didn't allow me to do that. So it meant doing all the archival research, doing all the reading, looking at all the photographs that I could, reading memoirs from a model that worked with Dior, from his director of sales. She wrote a memoir as well. And then my first draft is all imagination. So I'm making the whole thing up. It's just story. And when people are buying a novel, that's what they're coming for. They're coming for the story. So for me, it's important that the story is paramount. That first draft is full of gaps and holes and notes to myself to find out more about this. So after that month of research, my first draft has acted like my research scope. It's shown me the bounds of where I need to stop researching. I need to research to fill all those many gaps in that first draft. Then I write a second draft where I pull in all of that research information, which allows me to embellish, to add more detail in, to make it authentic, to make sure that it's as factual as possible. So therefore, I find it relatively easy to know when to stop because I have my first draft, which tells me when to stop.
Now, this is extraordinary because we're talking about the world of Dior here, but I know, having just finished the book, well, actually finished the book a few months ago, this is all about spying. This is all about the war. This is all about so many other things than Dior. We've talked a lot about Dior, but when did you decide you were going to make Alix a spy?
So there were 2 things that made me realize I needed to get her to do that. The first was when I realized I wanted to write about the whole way of life of women after the war. To show that properly, I needed to show what women were doing during the war. So therefore, Alix needed to be doing something during the war. And I came across a woman named Mary Bancroft, who was working as a spy in Switzerland during the Second World War. And I went, wait, what? Switzerland was a neutral country. How could people have been working as spies in Switzerland during the Second World War? And how could one of them have been a woman? I hadn't heard any of that history. So, of course, me being me, I had to go in and buy Mary's autobiography and read that from cover to cover, which is called Autobiography of a Spy. And she talks about how she worked with a man called Alan Dulles, who headed up the Bern station of the Office of Strategic Services, which was an American intelligence organization where they ran spies, they gathered intelligence, etc. during the war. And he later became the director of the CIA. And they worked largely with the Italian partisans in the north of Italy during the war to support them in fighting against the Nazis and the fascists, because everyone knows that France was occupied by the Nazis during the war, but very few people know about the Italian experience, which was also occupied by the Nazis during the war. And the Allies, whilst they invaded Italy in 1943, they got stuck right in the south of Italy. So the whole of the north of the country was overrun by Nazis, under fascist Nazi control. And the men who wanted to resist that all fled to the mountains and lived there and tried to sabotage, to defend their towns, to make small attacks on the Nazis from the mountains. And so when I found out about all of that this was happening from Switzerland, this was being managed by this Alan and this woman called Mary, I thought, right, Alix needs to go and work alongside them, and she's going to work with those Italians, because there was another story about forgotten women there. Because how did the men survive in the mountains during wartime? In winter, Italian Alps in winter, like damn cold, let me tell you. I've driven through there and it's freezing. They survived because they had this group of women called staffette, who were their wives, mothers, girlfriends, daughters, who took food up to them, who took clothing up to them, who took the messages from them and ran the intelligence between Italy and Switzerland, who also took them guns and arms and sabotage supplies, who were tortured and killed by the Nazis in the same way that the men were, but who, after the war, when there were the liberation marches through Italy, they were told they were forbidden to march with the men, even though they'd suffered just as much and been just as brave. They walked 80 kilometers in a day up into those Alps carrying supplies. And there was one party that allowed women to march with them, but they asked them to march at the back behind them, all the men. And the women recounted that as they marched along, they could hear the spectators calling them whores. And I thought, how heartbreaking would that have been to have worked alongside women who were killed, who lost their lives, and to know how integral you were to the survival of those men who did fight heroically, but to then be called a whore in the aftermath of that. So I wanted to resurrect those incredible staffette and write about them. So Alix works with them during that wartime part of the book.
Right. Wow. Okay. Now I see how you do it.
It's all about connecting seemingly unconnected threads in some strange way in my mind.
Well, you do a wonderful job. Rena Pranotto has said, "Hi, Natasha, loved every single page of Alix." Her question is, what made you choose House of Dior for this book rather than other fashion houses?
I guess the reason was because the new look was the thing that changed the fashion world forever in that year, 1947, and because I was so interested in the changes in women's status immediately post-war, the one thing that was most emblematic of that, and that was often scapegoated as being a part of that kind of, redomestication of women, was Dior's new look. So for me, it was most interesting to tackle that and to look at it from other perspectives and add a few more layers and depths to that argument about Dior being overly feminizing. One of the things that people often say is, but it put women back in their corsets. And actually it didn't, because you didn't need to wear a corset in a Christian Dior gown, because he built in the internal architecture of one of those gowns is quite astonishing. And all the underwear that you need to wear is built into the dress. So it was throw out your corset, just put on your gown and you're ready to go. So that's why Dior.
Sounds great. I like that idea.
Me too.
Now, Beth has asked, do you have any input to the cover? So what goes on the cover? We were talking about this cover earlier and how Natasha's novels are translated into many, many different languages in many different countries. And some of the countries have different covers, don't they?
Yes, they do. In fact, there's always a different cover for Australia, the UK and the US, and then often the translation markets are different again. Although sometimes they might take some imagery from some of those covers. But yeah, I'm very lucky. So I'm at the Hachette offices, and obviously the automatic lights have just turned off. So I'm sure there is someone here that will rectify that. And I promise I'll be back on in full light in just a minute. But let me keep talking in the darkness, and you can at least hear me even if you can't see me. So now the question was about, do I have any input into the covers? So yes, I'm very lucky. My publisher at Hachette, an amazing woman called Rebecca. We talk a lot about how we see the covers, what kind of imagery we're thinking might work. She asked me to send her photos from my mood board. So I send her all of that kind of stuff. And then she works with an amazing designer who we've worked with for probably all of my covers for the last few years. And the hardest part is always finding that woman on the cover who looks authentically of the era, who doesn't look like she's kind of playing dress ups. And we're very lucky to have come across this incredible woman called Ida, who is a wonderful Serbian model. And she has a natural vintage style. She loves to do the vintage hairstyles and vintage clothing. And she's actually graced 4 of my covers now. So eagle-eyed readers will see her on the cover of the Paris Seamstress, the French Photographer, the Riviera House, and now the 3 Lives of Alix and Pierre. So I do apologize for the lighting. I'm sure it will be fixed in just a minute.
Okay. Now, Suze Charles says that she's spoken to you on your Instagram page. You posted pictures of Lauren Bacall, and when she commented on it, you said Lauren Bacall was the inspiration for Alix.
Yes, that's right. There we go.
How did that connection come to you? Because that's not an obvious one, is it?
No, it was just, I was Googling around for photographs of women who were particularly well known in the 1940s and 1950s, just to get a bit of kind of character inspiration, because when you're starting off fresh with a character, you've really got a blank page, and sometimes it's nice to have a little bit of reality to hang that your imagination on, to allow your imagination to fire, I suppose. And I saw this incredible photo of Lauren Bacall when she was very, very young. I think she was about 18, and she's sitting cross-legged on the floor in this kind of jumpsuit. And she's got her elbow propped on her knee and her chin propped on her hand, and this little smile on her face. And she doesn't look like she's wearing any makeup. Her hair looks completely natural. She just looks so beautiful and so happy and so content, but also so strong and so fierce. And I thought, oh my God, that is my Alix. Absolutely. So that photograph of Lauren Bacall sat on my mood board, my inspiration board, for the entire time I was writing the book. And then I found a couple of other photos of Lauren Bacall that also reminded me a lot of Alix. So she was definitely my inspiration for the character. And, you know, what better inspiration to have?
So you have a mood board, do you?
Of course, yes. So I've got a big whiteboard next to my desk. And so for this one, it was covered with pictures of the original townhouse on Avenue Montaigne that the House of Dior began in. It was covered with photographs from that first showing of some of the different gowns and suits, photographs of those women who worked alongside Dior. So Madames Bricard, Raymond, Carré, and Luline, who are all characters in the book. I had a photograph of all of them, as well as Christian Dior himself, of course, and photographs of key Parisian icons that play a role in the book. So photographs of the Pont Alexandre III, which is the most beautiful bridge in Paris, where the book kind of opens on that bridge. A picture of the Taboo nightclub in Paris, which was a troglodyte underground cellar nightclub that Alix spends a fun night in. Pictures of the Ritz Hotel, so the little bar at the Ritz, which no longer exists, but I had photographs of that, and the Ritz itself were on my wall, as was that one room at the Ritz that has an outdoor terrace that is owned by, well, is stayed in by a character in the book, was on my wall. So all of these great.
Have you stayed at the Ritz?
No, I was booked to go and stay there in June 2020. Obviously, something happened in 2020, which forbade me from going to Paris to stay at the Ritz. So, and I didn't get there last time because we had this apartment. So that's on my bucket list to actually go and stay there. But instead of staying there, I went and had afternoon tea at the Salon Proust at the Ritz this time, and indulged in Alix's favorite food, chocolate tart, and her favorite drink, French 75. So I had a very Alix and Pierre experience at the Ritz.
So you have such a terrible time researching the book. Michelle Ubergang has asked, who are your favorite historical fiction authors, and are you influenced by any of them?
I think that you can't help but be influenced by almost every book that you read, whether it's just noticing the way someone uses words or language, their turn of phrase, their style, the way they plot, their settings. You know, I'm an avid reader, and I always have been. And I think that's how I got into writing in the first place, was that I spent my whole childhood reading and loved to read so much. So it's always hard to say that you're directly influenced by any one writer or book, but I would say that every book I've ever read, from the very first moment that I could read, has influenced me in some way to be able to develop that ability to love words and to want to play around with words. But some of my favorite historical novelists, so we are so blessed and so lucky here in Australia to have some incredible historical novelists, people like Kelly Rimmer, whose books I love. Her latest book is The German Wife, which I can thoroughly recommend to you. Also other writers like Belinda Alexandra, whose latest book again is called The French Agent. So a bit of a French theme going on there. I actually caught up with Belinda over the weekend, and she's an amazing writer as well. Another writer whose book that I loved, set in Renaissance Italy, so very different to my kind of sphere, is Emma Harcourt, whose book The Brightest Star came out earlier this year. So there are three great Australian writers of historical fiction for you. So please go and seek out their books.
Bianca Smith asks if there are any characters in the book that are based on real people, besides Dior, of course. You've just mentioned that those atelier staff were, they're all real people, yes?
Yes, absolutely. So the four main women that you'll meet in the book who work at the house of Christian Dior: Suzanne Luling, the directrice of sales; Madame Carré, who was the director of the ateliers; Madame Bricard, who was Dior's assistant designer; and Madame Raymond, who headed up the studio, are all characters in the book, and they are all real people. Also in the Italian storyline of the book, Swiss Italian storyline, Alan Dulles and Mary Bancroft, as I mentioned before, are real people as well. And also another fabulous real character was Carmel Snow, the inimitable fashion editor of Harper's Bazaar, who had, who really did change and shape fashion journalism over those decades where she was working in magazines, but who had a terribly tragic and sad personal life. And I guess to me, was probably a heartbreaking representation of the struggles women had to be working mothers and working wives at that time. So she's a character in the book, and pretty much everything you read about Carmel in the book is based on fact, on her own very ebullient autobiography and less ebullient biography by Penelope Rowlands about Carmel Snow.
All right. Bianca has also got a few other questions for you, actually. Which cocktail, that I have to say there are lots of cocktails in this book, people, so get your cocktail cabinet out. Drinking. Which cocktail do you feel would best represent Alix? And then secondly, your favorite iconic Dior piece.
Okay, so, well, the cocktail of the book is a French 75. So my two favorite drinks are champagne and gin. And a French 75 is basically taking champagne and gin and putting them together in the same glass. Like, is there a better definition of heaven than champagne and gin hanging out in the same glass together? I don't think so. You add a bit of sugar syrup to that and a dash of lemon, and then you sit back and you don't drink very many of them because they are much more potent than they look and then they taste. But that is Alix to a T. A bit of French sparkle and a bit of French bubble, but with the added depth of the gin and the danger of the gin too, actually. So try those when you're drinking the book. And in terms of my favorite Dior piece, I have quite a lot, I would say. So there is a gown in this book called Compiègne, and Alix wears that to a ball in the book. And I wanted there to be a masked ball in the book, because masked balls were a big thing in Paris in the late 1940s, and they were extravagant affairs, and everyone tried to outdo each other in hosting those balls. So this one is held on the Piscine de Ligny in Paris, which is a floating swimming pool on the Seine River in Paris, because obviously the Seine, you need a bit more water, you need to throw a swimming pool on there as well. So it's a pool that is surrounded by sort of balustrading, and it's very Victorian era in its adornments. It looks like a theatre, I guess, from the inside. And a ball was held there in 1947, a masked ball. And the other reason I wanted to have a ball in this book was because I read this amazing anecdote from one of Christian Dior's mannequins published a little tiny thin book about her experience working one season at Dior as a house model. And she talked about the cabine, which is where the mannequins all get ready for the shows. And around the top of the cabine is a balustrade. And so some of the dresses are so big and so spectacular and heavy that they're really hard to get down the staircase and into the cabine. So instead of doing that, this balustrade backs straight onto the ateliers, and the seamstresses can bring these large, heavy gowns out from the ateliers onto the balustrade. The mannequin is standing down in the cabine below, and they literally drop the dress from the balustrade down onto the mannequin below. I thought, oh, wow, that is such a glorious image. Imagine standing down there as this Dior ball gown descends quite literally from the sky onto you. And I loved that idea so much. So, of course, when I was recreating this in my book, Alix is the person standing in the cabine as the seamstresses are dropping Compiègne onto her head. And Compiègne is a ball gown made from a fabric called velours au sabre, which is the most difficult fabric to make. It's like double warp Duchess satin, and a seamstress sits there and with a tiny little saber or sword, she cuts away the weft threads to reveal the warp threads underneath, and the pattern that appears in relief like velvet, and it's exquisite. And that's the kind of thing that haute couture does so well. These labor intensive, very specialized techniques that require a lot of expertise. So go and have a look at photographs of that. You'll find it on my Facebook and Instagram page if you want to know exactly what that dress looks like. It's quite divine.
God, that sounds amazing. Helen Hancock has commented that on your latest recent trip to Paris, which wasn't very long ago, was it? We're talking very recent, weeks ago, yes.
Yes, so 3 weeks ago, yeah.
Did you have a drink in the place that your characters had a drink? And if so, how did that feel?
So I couldn't unfortunately go to the Taboo nightclub where Alix goes because it no longer exists. There's a plaque on the street outside where it was saying that the Taboo nightclub was there. So of course I went and paid homage to the plaque. But I did go and sit, as I say, at the Ritz at the Salon Proust, and I had my French 75 there. I couldn't go to the little bar because it no longer exists. But those were the main places that I explored. There's also another couple of cafes that I did have in the book and had to kind of cut in the edits that I did go and visit as well, on the Rue de la Paix, which is at that in the 1940s, it was kind of the street to be seen. So I did that as well, just because, you know, when you're in Paris, you should always go and have a lovely drink in a cafe on the Rue de la Paix.
How does it feel for you when you do that? You must get such a little tingling that this is your world as well. This is your created world.
Oh, it is. It's really lovely. And that's why I do it, because, you know, here I am in Paris, which is, you know, virtually unchanged between now and 1947. Obviously, some things do close down, like the Taboo nightclub, probably because it was a fire hazard. And we're much more strict about those things these days. But, you know, largely everything is still there and everything still exists. And I have this wonderful story to share actually about the Ritz when I was there, which kind of made me feel a little bit like maybe Dior might have felt, I suppose, sometimes. So I was leaving the Ritz after having my gorgeous afternoon tea at Salon Proust, and there were security guards at the entrance doors holding back this crowd. And it was in the exact moment that I was exiting through the doors. So from an outsider's point of view, it appeared as if the security guards were there holding back the crowds who were there to witness me walking out of the Ritz. But an eagle-eyed viewer would have seen a car parked outside the Ritz that was having its door opened, and some celebrity was coming out of the car. And they were actually all there for her, and the people were being held back because they were going to mob her. But there was this split second where I thought, yeah, this is for me. So that was a bit like I imagine Christian Dior might have felt, because he was certainly mobbed on his trips to New York that he took in 1947.
Soon, Natasha, soon.
Yeah.
Now, lots of people are asking if you can give us any hints of what you're working on next.
Yes, I can give you a hint of what I'm working on next. So there will be a book coming out next year. I can't tell you the title of that yet because we're still working that out with the US and the UK, so we can have a common title that works for everybody. But there's a character in The 3 Lives of Alix and Pierre called Mitza Bricard, who was actually Dior's assistant designer. She was an incredibly talented woman. Fashion photographer Cecil Beaton called her one of the greatest designers that Paris has ever known. But somehow in the history books, she has been turned into Dior's muse. That's what she's referred to as now. And I was fascinated by how a woman who was referred to by one of the most preeminent fashion photographers as an amazing designer could suddenly be demoted to the position of muse by largely the male historians who've been writing about the couture house since then. So I wanted to unpick that. So it's a little bit about her. And I also have a large 1970s storyline in this book, which was super fun to write, set around the 1973 Battle of Versailles, which took place in France, where the French designers were pitted against the American designers. And everybody thought the French designers would win because it's France and fashion, but the American designers won the day. So it was lots of fun to write.
But we're back in France.
And New York in the 1970s, which was great. I mean, New York in the 1970s, what more fun place could there be to write about?
Okay, look, we've only got a couple of minutes to go. Thank you, Natasha, and thank you to all of our partners at Hachette and QBD. Thank you, everyone out there, for coming. And just once more, if you haven't already, you can purchase special signed copies of Natasha's new book, The 3 Lives of Alix and Pierre, from our event partner, QBD. There's a link in the chat box on your screen. And please don't forget our next Books and Bubbles event. It's on Wednesday, the 23rd of November, when I'll be chatting to Katie Nunn about her new book, The Only Child. Visit Books and Bubbles, booksandbubbles.com.au to register for this event, and also to sign up to our newsletter and find out about our past events that are available on demand. You can watch this one again if you like, listen to some of those amazing descriptions of the Dior gowns there from Natasha. Natasha, it's been such a joy. We could go on chatting forever, couldn't we? But unfortunately, we have to stop.
Thank you so much, Juliet. It was, as always, lovely chatting to you. And thank you so much to everybody who has watched tonight. I really appreciate all of your support. Everyone who's bought a book or recommended the book or read the book, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.